In 1970, a young woman was found brutally murdered in her Sacramento apartment. The case went cold. For over half a century, the killer remained a ghost. Then in 2022, everything changed. Nancy was 28 years old. She was a respected court reporter with an impeccable record. She was born in 1942, raised in a working-class family, and worked her way up in the Sacramento legal system. She was engaged to Ferris Salami, the county's chief public defender and an influential figure in the justice system. It is believed they met through professional circles at the Sacramento courthouse when Nancy worked as a court reporter. Friends described her as poised, intelligent, and independent. She loved music, decorating her home, and reading late into the night. Sunday, October 25th, 1970, was quiet and ordinary for Nancy Bennallack. It was a warm autumn day in Sacramento. That afternoon, Nancy went to visit a close friend. They spent time chatting over coffee and catching up. Nancy was in good spirits and excited about her upcoming marriage to Ferris. She mentioned plans to join him in Lake Tahoe the next day for a conference he was attending. She said she had some work to wrap up that evening, including organizing court notes and typing transcripts. After returning home, she called Ferris around 11 p.m. They spoke briefly. She told him she was looking forward to the trip and planned to get to bed soon. Nothing unusual, just the routine conversation of a couple planning their week. Nancy then put on music, something soft, likely instrumental, which she often played at night, and went to bed. This was the last time anyone saw or heard from Nancy Bennallack. Nancy was supposed to join Ferris at his home early in the morning before they left town for their trip to Lake Tahoe. When she didn't arrive, Ferris wasn't immediately worried. He assumed she might have overslept. He tried calling her apartment but got no answer, called again several times, but the phone just rang. That's when the worry began to set in. By early afternoon, there was still not word from Nancy. Ferris then drove to her apartment complex on Bell Street in the Arden area of Sacramento. He knocked. No response. The door was locked. The windows were drawn. The stereo could be faintly heard through the walls, still playing music from the night before. Then he noticed something else. The sliding screen door had been slashed open. Ferris forced the door open. What he found would haunt him forever. Nancy was on the floor of her bedroom in her nightgown. She had been brutally stabbed over 30 times. Blood covered the floor, the bed, and the walls. There were no signs of a robbery, no evidence of sexual assault. Nothing appeared taken. Even music was still playing from Nancy's stereo. Ferris staggered out of the apartment and called the police. The crime scene was gruesome and chaotic. When Sacramento police arrived at Nancy Bennallack's apartment on the afternoon of October 26, 1970, they immediately secured the area. Officers and detectives began photographing the scene, collecting physical evidence, and trying to understand what had happened inside apartment 11. Nancy had been killed with a knife, but the weapon was nowhere to be found. Her attacker had entered through the sliding glass door. A screen had been cut open with precision. This wasn't a random break-in. This was someone who knew how to move quietly. There were bloody footprints, likely from the killer, but no fingerprints. The attacker seemed to have wiped down surfaces or wore gloves. Blood, however, was found on the screen and leading away from the apartment. Investigators believe the killer cut himself during the attack. A small trail of blood leading into the apartment complex's exterior walkway supported that theory. Detectives began working around the clock, and their first priority was to investigate those who knew Nancy. Her fiancé Ferris Salami was among the first to be questioned. Although he appeared deeply distraught, the police followed standard procedure. It soon became clear that he had a rock-solid alibi. He had been on the phone with Nancy at 11 p.m., and several of his professional colleagues vouched for his whereabouts throughout the night. Ferris was ruled out almost immediately. Next came Nancy's neighbors. Living in a second-story unit, it was unlikely a stranger had randomly climbed onto her balcony without being seen. Investigators focused on men who lived nearby, including one neighbor, a young law student who had a casual acquaintance with Nancy. He had reportedly expressed romantic interest in her. He cooperated with police, but his alibi checked out, and he was removed from the suspect list. Friends were asked about Nancy's past relationships. Former boyfriends, co-workers, acquaintances from the courthouse, all were tracked down. Interviews numbered in the hundreds. Police even explored whether Nancy may have had a stalker. She'd mentioned once to a friend that a man had followed her home from the courthouse weeks earlier, but she never reported it to police. That lead went nowhere. Perhaps the most significant clue was the unknown blood found at the scene. It didn't match Nancy's blood type. Police suspected it belonged to the killer, injured during the attack or while escaping. But this was 1970, long before DNA analysis was available. Blood typing was used, but it wasn't nearly specific enough to pinpoint identity. So while it gave investigators hope that they had a piece of their suspect, they had no way to use it yet. Detectives were baffled. There were no signs of robbery. Nancy's jewelry was untouched. Her purse was in plain sight. Nothing was stolen. There were no signs of sexual assault, either, which is unusual for a homicide this brutal. Nancy was attacked, with such rage that detectives believed the killer may have known her, or had projected something onto her. They theorized that this might have been a sexually motivated attack that the killer couldn't complete, or something even more disturbing, an involuntary fantasy fueled by obsession or delusion. But with no witnesses and no forensic path forward, the theories remained theories. Investigators had a timeline. They had a theory, had a pool of suspects. But they didn't have the one thing they needed most: a name. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the case began to fade from the headlines and into the cold. As 1970 turned into 1971, the investigation into Nancy Bennallack's murder stalled. Detectives had chased every credible lead. They had questioned more than 500 individuals. They had scoured the apartment complex, cross-referenced court records, and canvassed the Sacramento legal community. But nothing, not one solid lead, ever brought them closer to a suspect. By the end of the first year, the media attention faded. And as other cases emerged, Nancy's file quietly moved from the front of the desk to the back of the shelf. The murder of a young, respected court reporter in the heart of California's capital city, just blocks from the courthouse, remained a mystery. As the 1970s became the 80s, and the 80s rolled into the 90s, technology advanced, but Nancy's case remained untouched. Her fiancé, Faris Salami, returned to work, but never fully recovered emotionally. He never married. The trauma of discovering Nancy's body and living without justice haunted him for the rest of his life. Nancy's parents passed away without answers. Her friends stopped talking about the case, not out of disinterest, but from exhaustion. Hope slowly, painfully faded. But something critical had been preserved. The blood. The blood found at the scene, believed to be from the killer, was stored properly for decades. Even in the 1970s, some investigators had the foresight to understand that science might one day catch up. In the early 2000s, Sacramento's cold case unit reopened Nancy's file. And in 2004, they sent the blood evidence for DNA testing. It worked. A male DNA profile was created. This was a breakthrough, the first real progress in over 30 years. But there was a problem. The DNA profile was uploaded to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a federal database of convicted offenders and arrestees. But there was no match. Whoever had killed Nancy had never been arrested, at least not for a crime serious enough to trigger a DNA sample. For years, the profile just sat there, waiting, a shadow in the system. By 2010, Nancy's case was one of the longest unsolved murders in Sacramento County. But new detectives had joined the cold case team. They brought not just new energy, but new tools. And they weren't ready to let this one go. They began reviewing the case from scratch and make use of the new technology to solve the case. By the late 2010s, DNA analysis had transcended its traditional role of matching criminal profiles. With the advent of forensic genetic genealogy, investigators could now trace family trees and solve cold cases once deemed unsolvable. This innovative approach had already led to the capture of the Golden State Killer. Detectives uploaded the unknown suspect's DNA profile to public ancestry databases like GEDmatch. The DNA didn't match anyone directly, but revealed connections to distant relatives. From these fragments, genealogists meticulously constructed an extensive family tree, delving into birth records, obituaries, and historical archives. Over 2 years, they navigated through numerous familial lines, systematically eliminating potential suspects. This exhaustive process eventually led to a single name. His name was Richard John Davis, a man who, for over 50 years, had lived in the shadows of an unsolved murder. When investigators finally identified him in 2022, Davis had already been dead for 25 years, buried in Sacramento County, just miles from where Nancy was killed. In 1970, Davis was 27 years old. He lived alone in the same apartment complex as Nancy, just a few doors down. He was a quiet, blue-collar worker, described by neighbors as unremarkable. Born in California in 1943, he kept to himself and had no criminal record. He was questioned at the time, one of many neighbors casually interviewed. But with no apparent motive and no known connection to Nancy, he simply faded into the background. Police now believe his frequent moves after the murder may not have been random, though no evidence connects him to other crimes. His decision to leave Sacramento not long after Nancy's death has raised serious questions. Davis died in 1997 at the age of 54 from natural causes. He was never arrested, never publicly suspected. But DNA doesn't lie. When his genetic material was finally matched to the blood found at the crime scene, it confirmed what detectives had waited decades to hear. Richard John Davis was the man who killed Nancy Bennallack. To this day, no definitive motive has been confirmed for why Richard John Davis murdered Nancy Bennallack. The two had no known relationship, and Davis, a quiet, seemingly unremarkable man, had never been arrested or publicly linked to violence. But the brutality of the attack, the setting, and the lack of theft or sexual assault point to something far more personal or deeply psychological. Investigators have long suspected that the crime may have been sexually or obsessively motivated. Davis lived just a few doors down from Nancy and may have watched her from afar, fixated on her life. Nancy was young, accomplished, and engaged. Perhaps everything Davis wasn't, whether driven by obsession, rejection, or fantasy. It's believed he may have entered her apartment with predatory intent and lashed out in a rage-fueled or delusional attack. Others suggest it may have been the act of a psychologically unstable man, acting on impulse rather than reason, a moment of violence that didn't follow any logical pattern, without a confession or deeper insight into Davis's state of mind. The motive remains one of the few pieces of the case that may never be fully understood. After more than 5 decades of silence, Nancy Bennallack's family finally received the answer they had been waiting for. Though many of her closest relatives had passed, her surviving sister, Linda Cox, shared what that moment meant to her. In a statement read by detectives, Linda expressed deep gratitude to the investigators who never gave up. She spoke not only of closure, but of all the life Nancy had missed, the memories they never got to share. "We have missed sharing our children and grandchildren and so much more," Linda wrote. "Nancy would have loved our ranch, all our animals, and the wide open spaces. How many times my husband and I have said she would have loved this life? Today, Nancy's family lives with a mix of sadness and relief, knowing that while the pain never truly leaves, the unanswered questions finally have a name." Her story, once lost in time, now serves as both a cautionary tale and a tribute to the power of persistence, science, and the people who refuse to forget her.